Welcome back to another episode of Your Hope-Filled Perspective, where it's always our goal to restore hope, renew minds, and empower listeners to live in their God-given identity. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Bengtson, and I never take it lightly that you choose to spend a few minutes of your week with us. Today, we are going to be talking about recovering from trauma and the mistakes of our past. The theme verse that I've chosen, though, for this episode is Psalm 147, verse 3, that says, "He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds." And I'm here as a living testimony to tell you that he does that. And we're going to talk more about that with my guest today. My guest is BJ Garrett, who's the award-winning author of Unwanted No More, From Exploited to Embraced by God. BJ is an energetic speaker, passionate about telling her life story of overcoming a life full of abuse and bad decisions. She loves serving on the mission field and serves as the executive director of the Christ-Centered Abortion Recovery and Education. Welcome to the program, BJ.
Well, thank you so much. Great to be with you.
I'm so excited to have you here because you've got a compelling story. And what I think it shows more than anything is it attests to the faithfulness of God to his promises in scripture, like that promise from Psalm 147, 3. But what I know from having interviewed hundreds of people on this podcast and in my profession is that so often our passion is birthed out of our own hurts and trials and experiences. And you've gone through some pretty difficult circumstances as a teen and a young adult. So to set the stage, would you share a little bit about that with our listeners?
Absolutely. So I kind of start by just saying that I grew up with a lot of ugly. I had a lot of abuse in my home, physical abuse, sexual abuse. My mother traded me for a bag of groceries when I was 12 years old. Lots of trauma in that, right? And unfortunately, because of those things that were introduced to me at a very young age, I responded like many young girls do, and I became very promiscuous. By the age of 14, I had a live-in boyfriend, and 5 days after I turned 15, I became a mother for the first time. And then that just kind of turned into a series of life-altering events. I worked in the sex industry for some years, multiple abortions. And then spoiler alert, the Lord rescued me, and here we are today.
Well, you've got a part of your history that nobody has ever shared on the show before, but I think it's important to touch on it because there are women who are being affected, who are being influenced, and who are making decisions that will change the course of their life. Can you share for just a few minutes what it was like being an exotic dancer and what led you to that?
Absolutely. What led me to that is I was a single mom with 2 babies, and I was terrified of being poor white trash, just to be honest. And I had grown up very, very poor my whole life. And here I am, a single mom of 2 babies. I've already had 1 abortion, and I had to provide for my kiddos. And I had a friend said, "BJ, you should go to the gentleman's club. They're always hiring." And so I was like, well, okay, let's see. And I ended up there. Initially, I was only going to be a waitress. That was as exotic as I could get. And but they knew that if they got me in the door and they showed me the money, eventually I would be on the stage.
Yeah.
And it was a hard life, but I would rationalize that I wasn't a prostitute and that I wasn't selling my body because I was on a stage and I was somewhat protected in that and I was in control. But the reality is I was trading my body for money, and that is prostitution. And I would justify, like, I may go home with 10 guys a month, but I got paid on a stage, not on a nightstand. So for me, that's how I rationalized it. But it was very unhealthy. I was so empty emotionally. But at the same time, like, there was this, I don't know, empowerment, because for the first time in my life, I was in control of my body. And these men couldn't harm me. I was the one in control. And I could say who, I could say when, I could say how much. That sounds like a Pretty Woman line. That's not what I meant, but that was what it was like. I was in control, and they could only touch if I allowed them to touch. And for someone who had been so abused physically, sexually my whole life, that was a really big deal to me. And it was empowering. So, but it was also, as much as it was empowering, it was also so damaging, because with every dollar bill that I earned, I got more empty, more cold-hearted.
Wow.
Through those years. And you just do what you have to do. And I would try to like compartmentalize, like on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, I'm exotic dancer. And then, Monday through Thursday, I'm mom. I was able to raise my kids. I wasn't on any welfare. They had the things that they needed. And so I just had this weird, unhealthy balance, but I tried to protect them from that. I never let them around any of my coworkers or any of the men, but you just do what you have to do to survive. And in that season of my life, that was my survival.
What brought you to the place then that you got out of that industry? Because there had to have been fears if what got you into it was trying to provide for your family. How do you leave something like that?
Yeah, well, I am very embarrassed to admit that I didn't get out of it for a long time. And whenever you're in that lifestyle, even if you get out, you often go right back. And so for me, I had actually gotten married, and I was out of that industry. But every time that we would have a light bill due, or rent was due, or or a hot water heater blew, whatever kind of financial tragedy would hit us, then I would go back. And I may just go back for that weekend or maybe for a few weeks, but I would always go back. And it's just this mindset of, I can go earn $1,000 tonight. And I would. And my husband hated it. I hated it. I hated him for letting me do it. But at the same time, I would not even allow him to tell me not to do it, right? Because I was kind of very independent, and I was not a very good wife at that time. But that's just what I always did. What got me out of it was it's kind of a long story, but we had a house fire. And so here I am, we lost everything, and I'm back at the club. My husband hates it. I hate it. Our marriage is in turmoil. And I get offered a position at this little teeny tiny tea room in little bitty Bullard, Texas. And I randomly accepted this position. And that's what rescued me out of it, because it was through that experience that I was surrounded by godly women who just loved Jesus, and they began to minister to me and ultimately led me to the Lord. And it was once I came to know the Lord and surrendered my life to him that I never went back to the club.
Wow. What an amazing testimony. And thank you, Lord, for that little tea room.
Yes.
Is it even still there?
It is still there. It is.
Really?
I still love to go to lunch there, and they still have the best raspberry tea you could ever have in your life. And little old ladies still go and eat their chicken salad sandwiches with a knife and a fork, and it's just precious.
So now you minister to many who are experiencing unwanted pregnancies. And I know that we all know many people who have gone through that, even if we don't realize that that's their story. What's the greatest lie that you see these folks believing?
I think the greatest lie for the women who have chosen abortion is that they're the only one, especially within the church. Our churches are filled with men and women who have abortion in their past, and they're so ashamed and so afraid to mention it, especially in the church, that they suffer in silence. But the reality is they're not alone. And for those that are facing unplanned pregnancies that maybe haven't yet chosen abortion, the biggest lie is that they can't do it. And for my unique perspective, I was a very young teen mom. When the world would say I shouldn't be a mom, somehow by God's grace, I chose life. And let me just tell you, my daughter is 30 now and she's amazing. She loves the Lord. She's an amazing mom. She's an amazing employee. She's an amazing church member. She's great. So despite that I was a baby raising a baby, God had a plan for that child and for us as a family. Yeah. It is possible, even when the world says this does not make sense, you're too young to have a baby. Maybe your circumstances isn't great, but if you can conceive a child, the child has a purpose. Maybe you're supposed to parent it. Maybe you're supposed to gift it to an amazing family. I'm very pro adoption. That was never encouraged in my situation, but I'm very pro adoption. But for me, becoming a mom at a young age, even though I made a mountains of mistakes in the process, I loved being a mom, and it really changed my entire path because I was going down a bad path really, really fast. And getting pregnant with her at 14 changed everything. I had to stop drinking. I had to stop doing drugs. I became a mom. And then here we are, again.
It sounds like that becoming a mom, even though you were so young, helped you make decisions with someone else in mind instead of yourself. Is that a fair statement?
Oh, absolutely. I didn't have a good idea of what a good mom was, but I knew what a bad mom was. I had a very good example of what a bad mom was. So in my mind, in my young mind, if I did everything opposite of what my mom did, really, which meant feeding my children and protecting them, then that made me a good mom. And even though I made, like I said, lots of mistakes, I was a baby, protected my little girl, and she never went to bed hungry.
So BJ, I'm going to ask a question because both professionally and personally, I know people who became pregnant, not out of a desire to have a baby, but out of unfortunate circumstances. And they have chosen to keep the baby. But now they're dealing with those children asking questions and even going so far as to say, I'm a mistake. Can you talk to them for just a minute?
That's so hard, Michelle, because I know, and there are no mistakes, they're not. God's word tells us that before we were ever born, he knew all of the things, right? And so there are no mistakes. And for those that are hurting in that, and I remember for seasons in my life wishing that, my dad at 12 years old spit in my face, told me he wished I had never been born. Let me tell you, there was times when I wished I had never been born either. Hindsight's 2020, and I can look back and God's using all of those ugly things in my life to minister to others. And I know those things were not a mistake. They're also not from the Lord. I get a really touchy when they're like, well, God allowed. Well, no, sin is sin, and sin is in this world. And God can use really ugly things for his kingdom's purpose, but that doesn't mean he allowed it necessarily. And I guess it's just semantics or whatever, but if he didn't stop it, I guess he allowed it ultimately. But he has a purpose. And if we will allow our pain to turn into purpose, he will never, ever waste it. And for those little ones that are growing up thinking they were a mistake, or they were conceived out of trauma or out of bad decisions, you know what? God does not make bad decisions. He just doesn't. And not to just put it all on God, but he is the creator, right? And he is able to take the ugliest of ugly and make it beautiful. And living as raising a young teenage, being a young teenage mom and raising a dynamic little girl who is an amazing woman of God now, that was not a mistake. And I also come from the perspective that I ended 2 children's lives by abortion. And I robbed them from ever knowing what their potential was or how they could influence this world. And and they don't get that chance to be amazing. So I don't know. I don't know if that answers the question or just kind of rambles, but there are no mistakes. Lots of pregnancies happen out of perfect circumstances. In fact, very few pregnancies and children are conceived when all things are right. When you have the white picket fence and the husband and the wife and the money and the jobs and the insurance and all the things, right? Very
for sure.
happen that way.
Absolutely. Friends, we're going to take a real short commercial break, but I want you to stick with us because when we come back, we're going to be talking more about recovering from trauma and the mistakes of our past when we return. We'll be right back. Welcome back to your hope-filled perspective, where today we are talking with guest and my friend, BJ Garrett. We're talking about recovering from trauma and the mistakes of our past. And before the break, BJ was sharing some of her upbringing and the traumatic experiences that she went to. BJ, as we move into this next segment, I think it's so important for us to talk about why is forgiveness so important?
Yeah, that is one of the things. I mean, that's kind of my life's purpose now, is because I have unfortunately lived with the burden of unforgiveness. And until you have lived with unforgiveness and traumas and all of those things, you really can't grasp why forgiveness is so important. And so for those that are watching, if there's anybody alive that doesn't have ugly that they've held on to in the past, I would like to meet you first off. But if there's anybody out there that doesn't get it, well, you just don't get it. But when you're holding on to unforgiveness, you're the one suffering. I would set up all of these conditions in my heart and my mind that when he would hurt the way I hurt, I would forgive him. When he would want me to forgive him, I would forgive him. And just all kinds of irrational things I would set up. But here's the truth, Michelle. Who was hurting? Me. They weren't thinking about me. They weren't thinking about my, rules I had set up in order to forgive them. They didn't care. They were on with their life. I was the one suffering. And when you're dealing with unforgiveness, you are the only one being damaged by that. And it took me a long time to wrap my mind around that forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation. It doesn't mean that I have to go back to that relationship or that I'm saying what you did to me is okay. What forgiveness is saying, I release you of the consequences in reference to how it affects me emotionally. And I'm going to be free from that. You're no longer going to have control over my emotions or my spiritual my spiritual life in reference to what you did to me. And I forgive you for that. And for me, that was a game changer because I was just held down in bondage. And I know, I don't want to use just these Christianese words, but it's just all consuming, especially when you have multiple traumas in your life. It's so consuming and you just get weighed down to where you cannot function. You just can't. So releasing that frees you to do what God calls you to do and to be free from that and to not be tied down with the shame and the pain and all of the things associated that comes with whatever you are holding on to and unforgiveness.
And I think forgiveness is a process. There have been people in my life where I have truly forgiven them, and then the enemy reminds me of the hurt, and I have to choose to forgive them again. And then the enemy reminds me of the hurt, doesn't hurt quite as bad, but it's still there, and I have to choose to forgive them again. It's a process. Very rarely, I think, is it a one and done.
Yeah, I don't think it's often a one and done, but I do believe it is a choice. And forgive because we're commanded to forgive. We don't forgive because somebody deserves forgiveness. We forgive because we've been forgiven and we're commanded to forgive. Every single time God commands us to do anything, it's for our good. That's no different with forgiveness. So he commands us to forgive because he knows we're the ones hurting when we don't forgive.
Mhm. Such a good point. Will you share, BJ, how do you handle trauma triggers today?
Well, thankfully, praise the Lord, they're a lot less frequent today than they used to be. And I think that's part of that process. I think that initially, as I began to heal through things, when they would come, it might paralyze me to where I'm like, I can't even take a breath almost. Smells, sounds, different weird things could just really take you right back to that trauma.
Yeah.
But as you begin to heal from that and the Lord begins to work in your life and those secrets start being revealed and released and the forgiveness begins to happen, those things still come because the enemy's always there. He's wanting to stop you in your tracks and he's good at his job. But what begins to happen is I might stop immediately and be like, oh, and kind of panic hits. But then I'm like, okay, I'm not there. I'm not 12 years old. I'm not 14 years old. I am a child of God. And so then I can breathe again. And then the next time it comes, it's less frequent. It's less impactful. Doesn't mean it doesn't still stop me at times, but it becomes less and less powerful over me. And then you just get to keep processing through that. And every single time you process through it, it gets easier the next time.
Mhm.
Comes the enemy still, he's roaring like a lion. He wants us stopped. But he really is powerless when we begin to trust the Lord with our pain and start using it. You know, I say this a lot, turning my pain into purpose. And I was just sassy enough, Michelle, that I'm like, okay, you're not using this. I'm going to use this for God's glory. And the more you allow your pain to be turned into purpose for him, for the Lord, the less those triggers can control you and stop you in your tracks.
Mhm. When you look back at recovering from the trauma that you went through and even some of the mistakes that you made, what was most instrumental in your healing journey?
Probably most instrumental is having people that love the Lord just love me right where I was at. And for me, I was so naive spiritually. I had been hurt a lot by the church and by so-called Christian people, pastors. It was really, I had a lot of ugly from the church. And so when God began to put people in my life that just love the Lord and they began to love me, and that love didn't cost me anything, that was really when I began to see a difference. Up until that point in my life, up until the tea room, love had always cost me something, usually myself, usually my body. And all of a sudden, here are these crazy people that were fun and they just loved Jesus. That was it. No strings attached. They didn't care about my story. Not that they didn't care, as in they didn't care. It just didn't matter. They loved me because I was there and Jesus says love. And so they did. And love changes everything, Michelle.
Mhm.
Especially if you've never been loved or you've been loved in only ugly ways, which is not really love at all. When you get genuine Christ-like love thrown into your lap, man, there's no drug that can match that. It is beautiful, it is pure, and it's addicting. You got to have more. You have to know, like, why are they loving me? What is this going to cost me? And when you realize it's not costing me anything, it cost him everything, then all of a sudden you need to be a piece of that. You want to be a part of that. And that was how I came to know the Lord. And then that was, again, here we are today.
So now looking back, how has God redeemed your life?
You know, it's just so ironic because all of the ugly things that I endured that were forced upon me, and my traumas and my abuse and the things that I forced upon myself by my own terrible decisions, that the Lord uses all of that now. Like, I wouldn't be doing this interview with you for all of these amazing people to watch and listen to if it weren't for those things. God has completely redeemed every bit of that. And what an honor. I'll never forget, my pastor's wife once told me, I was just ugly crying one day. I had learned some things, that there was a family member that had tried to adopt me. And I remember coming home and I was so mad at God because I had kind of healed from a lot of my junk, assuming there was no other out. Like this was the cards I got dealt, and so now God can use it. But then I found out there was another hand dealt to me, and God said no. And I was mad at him. Like, I was mad at God, big mad, ugly crying, mad at God, serving in full-time ministry at this point. And my pastor's wife came up, and of course, I'm just, verbally throwing up all of this emotion on her. And she looked at me in such love, and she said, BJ, my prayer for you is that someday you will thank God for your story, because you have an opportunity to reach women that I will never be able to reach for his kingdom's purpose. I had to, in that moment, make a decision. I'm either going to be mad at God, or I'm going to trust that he had a plan and I can thank him for my story. So from that moment on, I chose to thank him for my story and give him glory for every piece of it, because he has not wasted one tear, one bruise, one incident in my life. He uses it now for me to minister to others and help draw them out of some of those ugly places, or just love them where they're at. And that makes it all worth it. It does.
We were talking before about the importance of forgiving others, but I feel like we need to talk for just a minute about sometimes we need to forgive ourselves. How do we do that when we look at our past and Satan is always reminding us of our past mistakes and yammering in our ear about how we're not good enough, we're not smart enough, we're not lovable enough? I mean, you name it. We've all heard the lies. How do we get to that place where we can forgive ourselves?
Yeah. Forgiving ourselves is always the hardest. It just is. That's a reality. But the concepts of forgiveness don't change by the recipient. And if the recipient is you, if it's me, then I'm still commanded to forgive. And I'm the one suffering. Here's the challenge, because a lot of times we feel like we deserve to suffer for whatever happened to us or whatever we did to ourselves to get us to the point of needing forgiveness. And so we don't want to forgive. We deserve the pain and the trauma of those memories, but that's not biblical. So you have to just say to yourself, either I believe that God is who he says he is, and that his word says what it says it is, and it's truth, and I'm commanded to forgive even myself, or I'm not. And we know that his word is truth. And when we choose not to forgive even ourselves, we're saying what you did on the cross wasn't good enough for me. Not good enough. It was good enough for Michelle. It was good enough for Grace. It was good enough for all of these people. But what you did on the cross wasn't good enough for my pain and my sin and my shame. So I'm going to hold on to it. And you just die for somebody else. And when we look at it like that, that kind of changes our perspective, because none of us good Jesus loving girls want to tell Jesus that what he did on the cross wasn't good enough.
Such a poignant point. Thank you for sharing that. Friends, we're going to take a real quick commercial break, but when we come back, I'm going to ask BJ to share with you her hope-filled perspective. We'll be right back. Welcome back to your hope-filled perspective, where BJ, Garrett, and I have been having a great conversation today about recovering from trauma and the mistakes in our past. BJ, what suggestion do you have for someone that they could begin to implement today to make a change in their life? If they're listening and going, man, I got a lot of trauma and I've made some pretty bad mistakes, I don't even know where to begin. What would you say to them?
My first advice is always to find at least one safe person to tell. And that might be a best friend, it might be a church member, a women's ministry leader, it might be a stranger for that matter. I mean, I get emails from people I've never met and may never meet in person. But taking that massive burden, sometimes trauma filled, and breaking the chains of silence that Satan has on you is the first step. As long as Satan is keeping you silenced, he's in control.
Yeah.
The second you release that secret to someone, a safe person, don't make a Facebook post for crying out loud, but find a safe place, a safe person to tell your secrets to. And that's the first step. And you will be amazed at how instant that weight is released. Doesn't go away. It's not an instant fix, but it is the first step.
Absolutely. Sharing, when we share those deep, dark secrets, and I believe we need to share them with a safe person. So I'm glad that you said, don't post it on Facebook, and you may not want to share it openly in a big group, but find one trusted person. But just sharing what we view as ugly and broken and messy that we've kept hidden in the dark because we're ashamed, that allows God's light to come in, and that's when healing begins. But as long as we keep those secrets and they stay hidden in the dark, like you said, BJ, the enemy stays in control.
That's right.
If a listener is looking back on their life with shame or guilt or regret, what hope-filled perspective would you offer to them today?
I would just, kind of my life verse, or not verse, but my life saying is, no matter what you have done, no matter what's been done to you, there is hope and healing in Jesus Christ. And that is just so real. And that's because I've lived it. Like, I've done all the things, Michelle. I've had most of the things done to me. And if God can take and redeem all of that and heal all of that in my life, I mean, like, seriously, my life is like Maury Povich and Dr. Phil and Oprah on steroids. Like, it's so ugly. But God has redeemed every single piece of it. And literally, if he can use my story for any good at all, then I promise you, there is nothing you have done, nothing you have experienced that he cannot also use, heal, redeem, and be glorified through. And as that happens, and as that transformation happens, you are truly free. And when you're free, you get to live life with joy and happiness and without the burdens of all of those traumas. We were never meant to carry the burden of trauma. We weren't. Jesus Christ died for those traumas. All of those ugly things were placed on him, and he paid the price for them. Even when we feel like that wasn't fair, for like the ugly things that people did to me, to recognize that those things were also on him at the cross. When I'm holding unforgiveness, I don't really want those things on him. I want them on the perpetrators that did those things, right? But he died for all of that. And I don't have to carry those sins around. I don't have to carry those traumas around. I have been set free. And when you've been set free, you can finally live. Period.
Amen. When you've been set free, you can finally live. Friends, I feel like we need to talk about the verse from John 4:39 that says, many of the Samaritans from the town believed in him, believed in Jesus, because of the woman's testimony. This is the testimony of the woman who had had many husbands. And Jesus encountered her, loved on her, despite her past trauma, despite her past mistakes, despite her current situation that she was hiding from him. And when she encountered the love of Jesus Christ, she left there and told other people about him. So don't you dare for a moment think that your past trauma or mistakes are too embarrassing for God to use. None of us have it all together. We have all made mistakes, and the enemy tells all of us, you're the only one.
Yeah.
But if you will share your story with just one other person, like BJ has done, God wins. The enemy doesn't win anymore, and you have freedom. BJ, thank you so much for sharing of your story and your testimony and the redemption that you've seen God work in your life to give other people hope. Friends, if you know someone else who's really struggling, maybe they're embarrassed or feeling guilty or regretful over their past. Goodness, that is the case for so many of us, but consider sharing this episode with them to encourage their heart and give them hope that God has not forgotten them, has not left them, and is not done working in their life to redeem it all. Share this with them, will you? And while you're at it, would you consider subscribing to the podcast so you don't ever miss an episode of Your Hope-Filled Perspective? I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Bengtson. Today, we've been talking with BJ Garrett. If you go to the show notes at drmichelleb.com, we will have all of BJ's information, where you can find her book, and so much more free to you at drmichelleb.com. Until we meet again next week, I'm Dr. Michelle Bengtson. May you have a hope-filled week.